Now, you guys might have seen in the news, there were these set of influencers who were seen leaving the White House with a binder full of supposedly the first phase of the Jeffrey Epstein documents. What people later found out after the revelation of what was in those binders was that it was a lot of information that the public already had wind of. So people were very, very concerned as to why these influencers were basically being touted as having more information regarding the Jeffrey Epstein case, when in reality, it was information that the public was already privy to. For today's video, we are going to be breaking down the Jeffrey Epstein case. What are the different revelations that have come out about it? How did he get away with doing this for so long? And are there ties to foreign intelligence such as Israel? Now, if you're curious like me where Jeffrey Epstein even came from, you would be very interested to know that Jeffrey Epstein actually had got his start by working as a teacher at the Dalton School in New York. Now, the Dalton School teaches elementary, middle school, and high school students. And Jeffrey was, it seemed as though he was a mathematics professor at that school, or I shouldn't even say professor, he was just a teacher. And the students actually speak relatively highly of him, the ones that remember him from his teachings at that time. There's an article out by NPR that details Jeffrey Epstein and his role at the Dalton School, and eventually him leaving the school to start working as a financial advisor. After Dalton, Epstein went on to work at the investment bank Bear Stearns. According to the Miami Herald, Epstein got the job because an impressed parent told one of the bank executives, Ellen Greenberg, to hire Epstein. Give Jeff credit, he was brilliant. Lynn Copel, Greenberg's daughter, told the Miami Herald he was very smart and knew how to woo people, how to schmooze. So the Dalton School is known as this Manhattan prep school where a lot of rich and influential parents send their children. And so by Jeffrey Epstein being able to teach at this school, he was able to come in contact with successful and rich parents. According to an article put out by CBS News, apparently Jeffrey Epstein actually had tutored the son of CEO of Bear Stearns, which is eventually the investment company that he later went on to work for. Jeffrey worked as a junior advisor for about 3 years, and then he was able to move up to a senior advisor shortly after that. So a couple years after being a senior partner, Jeffrey Epstein later went on to open up his own firm. Now, one major stipulation about this firm was that he was only willing to accept clients that were worth over $1 billion or had assets that were over $1 billion. As you can probably imagine, Jeffrey Epstein was able to acquire his own wealth by just having a clientele of billionaires. Now, this list of clientele is obviously very important. We've seen the publishing of Jeffrey Epstein's contact book, which shows not even a celebrity studded contact list, but also different members of the government are also part of this list. It isn't really the most productive to associate every celebrity that you see with Jeffrey Epstein as having to do with that. And I mean that for all sides of the political spectrum. I've seen photos with Jeffrey and Naomi Campbell. I've seen photos with Ghislaine Maxwell behind Kamala Harris, and even Donald Trump with Jeffrey Epstein, which we'll get into in a little bit, but you can really pinpoint him with any celebrity that you want. All right, so let's talk about how this came to light. So all the way back in 2005, there was a young girl that was 14 years old that had basically shared with her parents that she was molested when she went to this person's mansion. As we later find out, this person was obviously Jeffrey Epstein. But what this little girl detailed was that she was brought there by 2 other girls. And as police was investigating her story, they later found that there were 2 other girls that had brought those girls, and then quickly started to kind of unweb a network of child trafficking. Now, at this time, this crime was associated with the residence that Jeffrey Epstein had in Palm Beach, Florida. As this investigation later broke out, we know that Jeffrey Epstein had residences in Palm Beach, Florida, Manhattan, New York. He also had an island in the US Virgin Islands, and 2 other residences that don't really get talked about a lot are the New Mexico residence and also the Paris, France residence. I was able to find a lot of other stories / mentions of the New Mexico residence in documents associated with the criminal trial. I haven't really found too much on Paris, France side but I haven't also necessarily looked for it. I just wanted to kind of highlight those as places that people don't really associate too much with Jeffrey Epstein. There's more association with his island nowadays. But taking it back to 2005 and the case with the 14-year-old girl, what the police were also able to investigate was that these girls were basically lured in by being paid about $200 to $300, and then they were told they were going to basically massage this man. Once they arrived, that massage would become increasingly sexual. Because there are so many victims, a lot of the victims share a very similar story, which is what made police confident that there was a true case here. But there is a diversity in terms of like the extent to which those situations would get sexual. Some of the victims do express that maybe Jeffrey Epstein would ask them to rub his nipples. Others say that Jeffrey Epstein would be masturbating as he was getting massaged. And then others mention kind of gradually more sexual things as far as like penetration. So the girls were all pretty much between the ages of 13 to 18 years old. And how was Jeffrey Epstein able to amass this Rolodex of underage women? It was through these other women that were of the same age. So he would basically have other 14, 15-year-old girls go and search out for more 14, 15, 16, whatever year old girls. And the way that he was able to make them commit to this was, one, he would have those girls still be paid for their fee of bringing in other girls. But he also kind of gave them this promise that, hey, if you didn't like that, what you can do instead is you can actually just go help me find more girls, and therefore you don't have to do what you just did, but you can do this other thing, which is just go find other girls like in your age range. Now, a part of that indictment included charges for sex trafficking, underage sex with minors, various different penalties. And at that time, what the Florida prosecution office was looking into was a case that had about already like 30 victims that were related to this case. Again, this was just to kind of tracing that web of connections for that one 14-year-old girl. Now, it was at this time that Alex Acosta was appointed the attorney district at the South District of Florida. Why this matters is because in 2007, Jeffrey Epstein was given an unusually lenient plea deal by Alexander Acosta. As part of this plea deal, I'm going to read to you from the Miami Herald. Not only would Epstein serve just 13 months in the county jail, but the deal called a non-prosecution agreement, essentially shut down an ongoing FBI probe into whether there were more victims and other people who took part in Epstein's sex crimes. The reason that the FBI even had gotten involved in this case was because the police department was actually asking for the FBI's help in this investigation because they believed that there were members of their own group that were compromising the investigation. I want to point this out because I feel like the unusually large plea deal refers to Alexander Acosta and almost implicating him in participating in some of the crimes that Jeffrey Epstein was associated with. And I do think that there is definitely a big case to make because obviously he was the deciding factor. But what I also want to point out was the same year that Jeffrey Epstein was caught was also his first year of being appointed as the attorney in South District of Florida. So that makes me think that he is still kind of serving somebody who is maybe slightly above him. And who is slightly above him is President Bush at the time. And whether or not that is the case, what we can see from just the activity of the police department themselves is they felt as though there were people within their organization that were compromising the investigation. So that doesn't necessarily specifically mean that that is Alexander Acosta. That could also be that there are several other people involved in the police department. Maybe it's just one individual who has been there for a long period of time, who is maybe in a senior role. Like I mentioned, not a lot of people talk about New Mexico, and there was the New Mexico, I believe it was either governor or mayor, that was found to frequent Jeffrey's residence in New Mexico. So the reason I mentioned that example is just because I want to say that I think Jeffrey Epstein has a history of connecting with important people, 100%, but I feel like the people that actually participate are maybe a little bit more regular than we think. You know, they probably serve roles where they're not exactly celebrities. They are just kind of regular people, but also in positions of power. Now, what this plea deal also entailed was that Jeffrey Epstein, as part of that 13-month stint in jail, he was also able to come and go generally as he pleased. He was allowed some release privileges, which basically meant that for basically 12 hours of the day, he was allowed to work from his home in Florida instead of being in the jail, and that was for 6 days of the week. So he was basically free roaming, probably would just spend the night sleeping in jail. He also lived in a private wing. There were a lot of benefits afforded to him for the scale of crime that he was committing. Again, this was something that the local police department felt was important to report to the FBI because of the number of victims that were part of this. Now, like I said, because of this plea deal, pretty much this whole story washed away. There was very little press done on it. If you were alive during that time, you do remember some stories coming out about it, but not much. I remember even seeing like the tape of his drive-through used a lot in like news stories that were coming out at that time, but really, we didn't really know too much information about it. The story like came and went, and it wasn't until the Miami Herald retouched on this story because Alexander Costa was going to be appointed to a federal level position where he was going to be overseeing task forces that were related to sex trafficking. So the Miami Herald put out this expose and basically rediscuss with the public what exactly Alexander Costa was part of at that time. Now, this expose eventually caused Alexander Costa to resign for the labor secretary position that Donald Trump was going to assign him to. The other interesting thing about this story is Julie K. Brown, who was one that actually broke that story. Thankfully to her, the news has gotten out about the story, but also, I'm like, Julie K. Brown, how did you exactly get access to sealed court documents that even the FBI was concealing? How did you know to even look for those documents is also another very interesting thing. I just think that it's funny because with the world of politics and also just media and celebrities, like you never really know exactly where news comes from. I'm not saying that news is fake, but I'm saying that there's usually some kind of political desire sometimes where you see these kinds of pieces come out to sway the public in a different direction. Like, I don't know if at that time Alexander Costa was running against anybody. I don't know if at that time the Democrats were trying to put out hit pieces on all of Donald Trump's allies, but this news was definitely coming from somewhere. This kind of leak was coming from somewhere because it's like, think about yourself. How would you just randomly stumble upon information about a random person? Even if you were investigating like I do with my channel, I'm not just like randomly keeping tabs on like a specific person and checking like court documents to see if there's anything associated with them. Like if I get leads from any subscribers, then I will maybe follow those, but I'm not necessarily like keeping tabs on everybody. So it just seems really interesting to me that she got a lead to this. It makes me wonder again, who is maybe the opponent that helped facilitate this. Now, like I said, we didn't get word of a lot of information regarding this case until 2018 when the Miami Herald piece eventually dropped. But what we later knew from 2018 onwards was that there were a lot of people of power that were implicated in those lists. And again, it was not necessarily just through the call book, which contained many of Jeffrey Epstein's clients and just friends or acquaintances, but it was actually through different flight logs that showed that there were different people involved with Jeffrey to a little bit of a deeper level. Like they would borrow Jeffrey Epstein's private plane and they would go on trips using his plane. So it was through that secondary list that people were able to kind of dwindle down a little bit more further into thinking, okay, it obviously is not just everybody's involved in this like sex trafficking ring, but it could seem as though maybe these people who are on his flight were probably a little bit more closer confidants to Jeffrey. So they're kind of trying to dwindle in on this kind of list of people. Additionally, in 2022, there was one of Jeffrey Epstein's survivors, Virginia Giuffre, I believe is how you pronounce her name, as she came out with other information from firsthand experience because she was 16 years old when she started to become involved with Jeffrey Epstein, first as like the masseuse and then as a girl that had brought on other girls to meet Jeffrey. Before I get into the perpetrators, I just want to make a quick note about the victims of this case. I do feel like it needs to be said because this case really honestly was only able to grow to the degree that it did because of the other girls that were involved in this. Now, I feel like a lot of times people want to say there is a complete victim and there is a complete perpetrator, but I do think that there is definitely a gray area. And when you have a person like Virginia Giuffre, you realize that she is someone who very much is within that gray area of she's a victim, but she's also a perpetrator herself. Now, I know you guys are probably gonna give me a lot of shit for saying that, but it is true. Like, Virginia Giuffre, she first obviously was victimized by Giuffre when she went to go give him a massage, but she actually worked with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, who was Jeffrey Epstein's partner at that time, for years. She said this herself, actually. She said that she would be on Jeffrey Epstein's island, and in between coordinating these sexual acts with Jeffrey and the victims, they were also spending just regular time together. She describes it herself as this little messed up family. I'm gonna play for you that clip.
So we were at the island by ourselves, Jeffrey and me and Ghislaine, and we had gone for a nice snorkeling event. I mean, in some ways, we were a little fucked up family. I mean, we would sit together and watch Sex in the City together, and we would go hiking. We would make things together. I mean, we collected all this pirate treasure, like just broken glass bottles, and we make a table from it. Like, we did weird family stuff. All right, so it just wasn't all about that, but that was how this worked, the inner goings of it. You know, it was.
And Virginia Giuffre in another interview also describes that she probably brought to Jeffrey about 70 to 80 women to have sex with him about 3 times a day. Again, I'm not saying that she is not a victim of Jeffrey. She was obviously a teenager, but she's also not completely not a perpetrator. Like, she also was involved to some degree. At some point, even if you're a teenager, you do something long enough that you definitely should be held responsible for your participation in those things as well. She also talks very candidly about this, so I want to applaud her for her transparency, but I also do think that it is important for her to accept accountability of her actions in a way that is meaningful to the other victims of this case. All right, so moving back to the perpetrators, we had different people such as Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, who were all named on these various different lists. Some showed closer relationships and some showed a little bit less so. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Bill Clinton, and Bill Clinton was named in various different court documents. Now, there is no victim that has directly said that Bill Clinton has touched, molested, anything of a sexual nature towards her, but he is seemingly very close to Jeffrey Epstein from the perspective of using his plane various different times, visiting him on his island, also traveling with him to Thailand. So there's a bunch of different kinds of little connections there that people associate Bill Clinton with participating in, but there hasn't yet been a victim that has said, yes, Bill Clinton has done this to me. We then have Donald Trump, and Donald Trump also is someone who is just seen in photos with him. They are shown to be close friends, but there is kind of less information on Donald Trump compared to Bill Clinton.
This next section is on former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Sorry guys, messed up here.
2016, when he was seen entering a New York City residence of Jeffrey Epstein. And then shortly after that, there were 3 young girls that were shown to enter that residency as well. I do want to point out that actually, at first, I was like, okay, well, maybe he's just visiting this apartment and there's also girls that live in that apartment. What I was able to find was actually that Jeffrey Epstein owns his own modeling agency that utilizes this building in New York City as a residency for the models that are being scouted from Eastern Europe. And I'm just gonna go out on a whim here and say, in my opinion, you have young girls that are scouted for modeling from Eastern Europe, and you are housing them in a New York City apartment, and the people that own that company are convicted child predators that is associated with other alleged child predators. I would not be surprised there if what was going on there was associated with pornography of underage individuals, especially if Jeffrey Epstein is used to taking a term that could mean something and then twisting it to be a sexual nature. Like when he said it will be massages, and then they find out that it's actually sexual acts, and it will be modeling, and they find out that it's actually associated with sexual acts. Like I said, this is my personal speculation, but when we see a pattern, it's worth considering that that pattern could exist in other spaces as well. Now, Prince Andrew has always maintained that he did not know Virginia Giuffre, which is the victim that was suing him in the 2022 lawsuit. He said that he had never met her, but Virginia describes meeting him up to 3 times, one of those times including sexual intercourse when she was 17 years old.
Virginia Roberts, dining with her, dancing with her at Tramp, or going on to have sex with her in a bedroom in a house in Belgravia.
I can absolutely categorically tell you it never happened.
Do you recall any kind of sexual contact with Virginia Roberts then or any other time?
None whatsoever.
Now, the damning evidence against Prince Andrew was that there's actually a photo of Virginia, him, and Ghislaine Maxwell behind him. Now, I do want to mention this case between the US Virgin Islands and JP Morgan Chase. It's very interesting, actually. So in 2023, basically there were 2 cases going on between these 2 entities. One, JP Morgan Chase was alleging that the former Prime Minister of the US Virgin Islands was earning $200,000 in her salary because of visas that she was issuing out for Jeffrey Epstein's victims. Correction, that was the former First Lady of the US Virgin Islands. Additionally, there is this second lawsuit, which is the US Virgin Islands suing JP Morgan Chase for saying that they had loaned out Jeffrey Epstein millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that were assisting him with carrying out this sex trafficking operation. And JP Morgan Chase did eventually settle this for, I believe it was $85 million. Again, I want to add this in because it makes you realize that there is a real operation here going on. The fact that both JP Morgan Chase and also the US Virgin Islands had enough dirt on each other to implicate each other and to settle cases just shows you how big this operation needed to be. Now, I would be remiss to not bring up the connections to the intelligence forces that are being named inside of the Epstein case. So I do want to say that a lot of this comes purely from allegations / speculation. I feel like I might be one of the only YouTubers to say that I don't necessarily think that Jeffrey Epstein is actually an intelligence specialist. I'm going to tell you why. So there is this speculation that Jeffrey Epstein is associated with the Mossad, which is Israeli intelligence. I'm going to read to you the theory of why this could be the case. All right, so this is according to TRT World. Publication Insider said Epstein had long-standing ties to Israel, including a business partnership with former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. Former Prime Minister Ehud Barak was identified in the recent dossiers. Barak was president between 1991 and 2001. He served in the Israeli army for 35 years before ascending to chief of the general staff. Now, the honey trap operation is said to have operated in terms of Jeffrey Epstein getting these very powerful men into situations with these underage girls, photographing them, maybe videoing them doing illicit activities, and then being able to use this to kind of blackmail them in future cases when those men get power or as they are already maybe in power. Another part of this is Ghislaine Maxwell and her connection to the Israeli intelligence. Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert Maxwell, was said to believe to have been part of Israeli intelligence. Now, this is pretty much probably true. The reason why this is the case is because after he died in 1991 or 93, he basically had the prime minister at the time and also 6 members of Israeli intelligence, head of Israeli intelligence, go to his funeral. So his association with those individuals seems to be legitimate. It doesn't take too much to realize that that is true. Whether or not those responsibilities passed down to Ghislaine Maxwell, I think is somewhat of a question mark, because even though, yes, it is her father, I always think I'm like, well, I'm not really exactly like my parents. I kind of do my own thing. I also know a lot of kids whose families are well off because I did go to a boarding high school that they don't really exactly follow the path of their parents just because the parent is involved in something that, even if it's very important and very lucrative. My other reason for thinking this is because I think that Jeffrey Epstein's list, while it is extensive in terms of his influence, I think that also his list is also very temporary. Like if Jeffrey Epstein was Israeli intelligence, why would Benjamin Netanyahu criticize Ehud Barak over the Epstein case. Because I was actually able to find a publication in the Times of Israel that showed Benjamin Netanyahu attacking Ehud Barak for his associations with Jeffrey Epstein, which showed me that Jeffrey Epstein's connection was really on a singular level, because if Jeffrey Epstein was someone worth protecting, then he would theoretically also be protected by Benjamin Netanyahu. Those connections also didn't matter when Jeffrey Epstein was charged once again in like the 2010s over similar charges, because that judge ended up putting Jeffrey in jail. So I think that Jeffrey's connections, or Jeffrey's level of being able to blackmail, was very much done on an individual basis. Because I think if he really did have that level of power, then I feel like that should have been carried out all the way through to present day, but it wasn't. Now, I do believe that in 2005, after the plea deal, I believe that Jeffrey Epstein actually had scaled back his level of involvement with R/influential people, because Jeffrey Epstein was with Ghislaine Maxwell for a large part of these crimes that were committed between 2001 and 2005. But it seemed as though they had broken up shortly afterwards, and Ghislaine Maxwell was not really in the picture of Jeffrey's life as a romantic partner up until Jeffrey was eventually arrested. It actually was found out that Jeffrey Epstein had another girlfriend and had been dating her for the past decade, pretty much, when she had first moved to the US from Eastern Europe. And she was actually the last person that had spoken to Jeffrey before he committed suicide, and was the last person that visited Jeffrey, which was only 10 days before he had committed suicide. Now, this girl's name was Karina Shuliak. I'm going to show you a photo of them together, but she's a young girl. I think she is in her early 30s, and it seemed as though she met Jeffrey and they started dating when she was in her early 20s. Now, there is a separate interview that I was able to find by a federal prosecutor, and she was basically describing that there are other cases associated with Jeffrey Epstein up until the year 2019. So I do believe that Jeffrey Epstein continued this operation all the way up until he was arrested. But I don't think that Jeffrey Epstein carried out his relationships with influential people past that date, because it seems as though there really weren't many influential people described after 2005.
Girls and women were subject to sexual assault, sexual exploitation through coercion, false imprisonment, where the passports at some points were taken away. The actions were just reprehensible. And it was quite a number of women, and we found through our investigation that at least up to 2018 that continued.
Now, this case has garnered a lot of attention today. Mainly, a lot of that attention has been coming from the Republican Party, who want to unveil the secrets that are underneath this Jeffrey Epstein case. Now, there has been public scrutiny over whether or not this is relevant to the public. Of course, people are worrying about the price of eggs, the price of gas, a bunch of other things, but the CIA and FBI is also being criticized for spending government time on actually having their agents focus on redacting information within this case. They feel as though, hey, there are actually more important cases that the FBI should be involved in, not spending countless of hours redacting document information for a case that has already kind of reached its conclusion. Now, one of Donald Trump's promises was that when he was going to go into office, he was going to release those files to the public, and that is why we see those influencers holding the binders of the Epstein files. I will say I think that the public is now in the belief that they will never really get the full scope of the files, just because it seems like this move to not release them comes from also the Trump administration. So it's like, well, Trump's also mentioned in those documents, so whether or not he's really going to implicate his friends, even if he's not exactly involved in it, whether he will implicate his friends or himself, like, he is most likely not seeming like he's going to do that. Also, when the Democrats were in office, it didn't seem like they wanted to exactly release them to the public, so it just made the public feel like no matter who is in office, most likely these documents are not really going to be available to everybody. The other thing regarding his case was that Jeffrey Epstein died of suicide in 2019 when he hung himself from his cell in Florida. And the public's reaction to this was also not assisted by the fact that cameras were not functioning properly, there were failures in protocol, and various different things that left the public with zero evidence as to a confirmation that Jeffrey Epstein actually had done this himself. So people were starting their own conspiracy theories, which is, to be completely fair, if everything malfunctions and nothing goes right, you have no proof that this very high-profile individual killed himself, of course people are going to speculate on that you did that to yourself. Now, I will close this video off by just saying that Ghislaine Maxwell was charged in 2019 and was sentenced to serve multiple decades in prison, which does mean that she is most likely going to pass away when she is in prison, because I think she was already in her like 40s, 50s. People also are calling on Carolina Shuliak, which is Jeffrey Epstein's last girlfriend, to potentially also be investigated for this similar crime, since we know that there is evidence of Jeffrey Epstein participating all the way up to 2019. And she has been his partner for the last 10 years. So it's like, again, we see a pattern. We're like, hey, should we check this? Should we check this one as well? let's do our due diligence here. But the reality is that there are so many people implicated in this case, like I said, and it's also to varying different degrees, whether it was knowing this information or actually participating in the activities. Anyways, I want to hear what you guys feel about this case, whether you think that I am wrong with my personal feelings on it, or whether you think that, hey, you know, we are maybe not talking about some uncomfortable truths. I want to hear it all. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to today's video. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!